The clock has struck midnight on the era of strategic patience, and the world is now staring into the white-hot center of a regional apocalypse. The Middle East ceased to be a landscape of manageable tensions and transformed into a terminal friction point where the diplomatic theater was incinerated in a single kinetic heartbeat. The air over Tehran is no longer filled with the rhetoric of defiance. It is thick with the acrid smoke of Operation Epic Fury as American and Israeli ordnance hollows out the Iranian capital. But as the first missiles impacted near Mehrabad International Airport and Resalat Square, the true nature of this conflict revealed itself. This is not a surgical strike. It is the beginning of a total systemic collapse. The cold eye of strategy sees past the rubble to a terrifying new reality. While Washington broadcasts images of cratered runways to prove its dominance, Iran has responded by turning the Strait of Hormuz into a kill zone, transforming the world's most vital energy artery into a graveyard for commercial shipping. The paradox of the American position is now a glaring strategic wound. The more the United States attempts to secure the global oil flow through overwhelming force, the more certain its destruction becomes. This is the asymmetric trap where a superpower's multi-million-dollar technology is being bled dry by a hydra of low-cost drone swarms and decentralized command cells that do not need a head to bite back. But the real move is occurring in the shadows of the global realignment. While the kinetic reality unfolds on the streets of Tehran and Beirut, a polarization event of unprecedented scale is shifting the earth beneath Washington's feet. Beijing has officially stepped out of the shadows, branding the United States and Israel as the sole architects of global instability. This is no longer a localized war over nuclear centrifuges. It is a high-stakes auction for the future of the Pax Americana. Inside the halls of the U.S. Senate, the internal fracture has begun as leaders realize that they have launched a war with an infinite cost and no visible exit ramp. Welcome to the dawn of the hard confrontation, where the missiles have already left the launchers, and the only question remaining is not who wins, but what will be left of the global order when the fire finally dies down. Dawn on March 11, 2026 in Tehran did not begin with the call to prayer, but with the sky-tearing shriek of cruise missiles and thick black plumes of smoke rising from icons of national power. Consecutive airstrikes by the U.S. and Israel have transformed symbolic locations like Resalat Square and the area surrounding Mehrabad International Airport into a labyrinth of rubble and twisted steel. These are no longer dry intelligence reports on a Pentagon digital map. This is a kinetic reality of blood and tears, where Iranian Red Crescent rescue teams dig in vain to recover victims' bodies. In the Resalat area, at least 6 civilians were killed in a single blast, a small number relative to the campaign's scale, yet one carrying immense political weight as images of charred vehicles and devastated civilian structures are broadcast live to the world. Iran claims the war has entered its 12th day with nearly 10,000 civilian sites hit and over 1,300 civilians killed. While these figures may be amplified within the diplomatic theater, the reality is that Washington and Tel Aviv are falling into a strategic media trap. By striking deep into urban cores, they have handed Tehran its most potent weapon, the legitimacy of the victim. Iran no longer frames this war as a technical nuclear sanction. They define it as a campaign of destruction aimed directly at the people and civilian infrastructure. Striking the Mehrabad airport area, the capital's transportation lifeline and pride, inflicts more than just physical damage. It creates a massive psychological shock, driving Iranian public indignation to a fever pitch. The paradox of overwhelming military power lies here. Every joint direct attack munition every month dropped on a crowded neighborhood inadvertently destroys the effort to isolate the Tehran government. Instead of inciting a revolt against the clerics, images of children and the elderly being pulled from the rubble are forging an unprecedented solidarity within Islamic society. For Tehran, every body recovered is a new diplomatic currency to be used on the international chessboard to convince neutral nations that the U.S. and Israel are the true subverters of global order. While strategic planners in Washington believe they maintain aerial initiative, the reality is they are losing moral initiative. Iran understands perfectly that they do not need to shoot down every enemy F-35. They only need to slow their opponent's progress by forcing them to face expensive political bills from international public opinion. When a nation feels struck at its very urban core, the question is no longer whether they will respond, but how devastating that response will be to force the opponent to feel a commensurate pain. Tehran is preparing for a counteroffensive where the line between military and civilian targets will be completely erased, plunging the entire region into an endless spiral of retaliation. The wave of retaliation launched on the morning of March 11, 2026, was not merely a military maneuver, it was a strategic broadcast of regional insecurity. By initiating what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps termed their 37th wave of strikes, Tehran signaled the end of the localized war illusion. This was a masterclass in the extension of pain, as volleys of multi-warhead ballistic missiles and suicide drone swarms bypassed the immediate borders of Israel to target the very foundations of the Western-led security architecture. The kinetic reality saw sirens screaming across Qatar, Bahrain, and the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, proving that the axis of resistance possesses the intent and the capability to turn the entire Gulf into a unified kill zone. The paradox of the American defensive shield was laid bare as reports flooded in of drone interceptions over the Kurais oil field and near critical military hubs in Manama. While Allied systems managed to down a significant percentage of incoming targets, the saturation logic achieved its psychological objective. When Bahrain is forced to sound air raid sirens and Saudi defenses are activated to protect their oil crown jewels, the strategic message is clear. If the heart of Tehran is under fire, no energy asset or military base in the region is off limits. Iran is effectively rewriting the rules of engagement, shifting the burden of the war from its own crumbling urban centers to the belt of interest that sustains the American presence in the Middle East. This expansion of the battle space creates a lethal dilemma for the Arab Gulf monarchies. They find themselves caught between the crushing weight of American military demands and the visceral reality of Iranian proximity. By launching strikes that force these nations to activate their defenses, Tehran is exposing the fragility of the Abraham Accords and other security pacts. The goal is to prove that the United States cannot guarantee the safety of its partners against a mosaic of fire. As a Houthi-linked projectile struck a container ship off the coast of the United Arab Emirates, the global shipping industry received a chilling reminder that the conflict has metastasized into a maritime insurgency. The strategic intent behind this wide-spectrum counterstrike is to transform the war from an U.S. versus Iran equation into a global system versus regional chaos crisis. Tehran understands that every interceptor fired by a Gulf state and every civilian basement filled in Tel Aviv increases the pressure on Washington to de-escalate. They are not fighting for a decisive battlefield victory. They are fighting to make the status quo of war so expensive and so dangerous for everyone involved that the international community eventually demands a halt. By shaking the entire belt of interest surrounding the Persian Gulf, Iran is betting that the collective fear of a total energy collapse will ultimately outweigh the American will to achieve regime change. While the skies over Tehran are dominated by American and Israeli jets, the real strategic chokehold is being applied at the surface of the Strait of Hormuz. On this day, the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations reported that a second cargo vessel was struck and engulfed in flames, forcing an emergency evacuation of the crew following a similar strike on a container ship in the northwestern sector. The kinetic reality is that the world's most vital energy artery has been transformed into a dark zone. In response, the Trump administration has executed a massive retaliatory strike, claiming the destruction of 16 Iranian mine-clearing vessels near the strait. The syntactic signature from Washington is one of absolute escalation, a warning that any further disruption to the flow of oil will be met with 20 times the force used to date. The paradox of this American stance lies in the fundamental difference between naval dominance and maritime security. While the United States possesses the capability to erase every Iranian hull from the water, it cannot guarantee the safety of a single civilian tanker against a decentralized insurgency. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has countered with its own terminal ultimatum. If the American-Israeli campaign continues to hollow out the Iranian heartland, not 1 liter of oil will leave the Persian Gulf. This is the logic of the hostage hegemony. Tehran understands that they do not need to win a naval battle. They only need to make the insurance premiums and the physical risk of transiting the strait so high that the global shipping industry effectively goes on strike. The retention pivot occurs when we realize that Washington is fighting a war of optics while Tehran is fighting a war of economics. For the United States, the destruction of 16 Iranian boats is a tactical victory meant to reassure the markets. But for the markets, the mere fact that 2 ships were hit and crews had to be rescued is a catastrophic failure of the security guarantee. The strategic irony is that by threatening 20 times more force, Trump is inadvertently confirming that the situation is spiraling out of control. This rhetoric does not stabilize oil prices. It signals to the world that a total high-intensity regional war is imminent, driving the global economy into a state of anticipatory shock. As the morning progresses, the Strait of Hormuz has become a ghost corridor. The Iranian Hydra has forced the world's most powerful military into a defensive posture where they must spend millions of dollars protecting every single transit, while Iran spends mere thousands on the munitions used to harass them. The capability versus intent gap is at its most narrow here. The U.S. has the capability to destroy, but Iran has the intent to disrupt. And in the world of global energy, disruption is just as lethal as destruction. What began as a campaign to punish a regime has morphed into a battle for the survival of the global supply chain, proving that whoever controls the bottleneck controls the fate of the 21st century economy. The sirens of Beirut have replaced the calls to prayer, marking a brutal expansion of the conflict that the world hoped would remain contained within the Iranian plateau. While the eyes of global energy markets are fixed on the burning wreckage in the Strait of Hormuz, a second, equally lethal front has ignited in the heart of the Levant. The kinetic reality of this war has moved beyond the Iranian problem and into a total regional conflagration. Israeli ordnance has just hollowed out a multi-story residential building in the Asat Barakas district, a densely populated civilian hub in central Beirut that sits far outside the traditional strongholds of Hezbollah. This is the axe of fire in its most literal form, where the distance between a civilian's living room and the front line has been reduced to zero. The paradox of the Israeli strategy in Lebanon lies in the doctrine of severance. By striking deep into the Lebanese capital without the traditional knock-on-the-roof warnings, Tel Aviv is attempting to shock the regional nervous system and sever the logistical and psychological links between Tehran and its most powerful proxy. But the strategic cost of this escalation is a rapid erosion of the moral high ground. As images of dust-covered survivors being pulled from the ruins of Lawson Timnan flood social media, the surface narrative of targeted defense is being replaced by a global perception of indiscriminate aggression. This is the credibility trap. While Israel gains tactical ground by eliminating potential command nodes, it loses the diplomatic theater as the international community watches the war spill into the living rooms of a sovereign capital. The retention pivot occurs when we realize that the strikes on Hanawe, Trey, Odd, and Sakiwe are not isolated incidents, but a deliberate widening of the kill zone. Israel is signaling that there is no longer such a thing as a safe rear for the axis of resistance. However, this logic is a double-edged sword. For every building collapsed in Beirut, the Iranian narrative of Western-backed genocide gains more traction in the global south. The people of Lebanon, describing a reality where nowhere is safe anymore, are being pushed into the very arms of the radicalization that the strikes were intended to deter. The strategic intent was to weaken Hezbollah's shadow, but the kinetic reality is that it is creating a unified front of resentment that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. But if we view this through the lens of long-term survival, the real move is the normalization of escalation. By striking central Beirut, a move previously considered a red line, Israel is daring the international community and the United States to stop them. This puts Washington in a strategic cul-de-sac, forced to either endorse the expansion of the war or publicly break with its primary regional ally. As the arc of fire thickens with the smoke of residential blocks, the war has officially moved into a phase of total friction, where the goal is no longer to win a specific battle, but to prove that your threshold for causing and enduring devastation is higher than your opponent's. The shadows of the Zagros Mountains now extend all the way to the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, as the diplomatic theater undergoes a violent and calculated restructuring. While the United States and Israel are locked in a kinetic cycle of bombardment and retaliation, the cold eye of Chinese strategy has identified the ultimate opening. Beijing has officially shattered its traditional policy of non-interference, issuing a high-impact declaration that shifts the entire burden of responsibility for the Middle Eastern apocalypse onto Washington and Tel Aviv. Foreign Minister Wang Yi has abandoned diplomatic ambiguity, publicly branding the campaign as a reckless expansion of hostilities into the Persian Gulf and condemning what he describes as indiscriminate attacks on civilians and non-military infrastructure. This is not a mere call for restraint. It is a polarization event designed to isolate the American superpower. By placing the weight of the war's escalation squarely on the shoulders of the Trump administration, China is effectively weaponizing the ganganjinye, the scales of justice in the court of global public opinion. The strategic intent is clear. While the West spends its hard power in the form of $4 million interceptors and billion-dollar carrier operations, China is accumulating soft power by positioning itself as the only rational actor capable of ending the madness. This creates a diplomatic shield for Tehran, allowing the Iranian regime to frame its own mosaic defense as a legitimate struggle against an unhinged imperialist duo. The paradox of this Chinese pivot lies in its economic foundation. While Beijing denounces the violence, it is the primary beneficiary of the resulting market chaos. The capability versus intent gap for China is filled by its massive strategic petroleum reserves, which allow it to watch the West's energy security evaporate while its own industrial heartland remains insulated. By blaming Washington for the volatility in the Strait of Hormuz, Beijing is signaling to the global South and specifically to energy-dependent nations in Southeast Asia and Africa that the Pax Americana is no longer a guarantee of stability, but a source of systemic risk. The retention pivot occurs when we realize that every bomb dropped on a Lebanese apartment block or an Iranian airport is a deposit into China's alternative global order account. The international community, once fearful of Iranian adventurism, is now being redirected to fear American and Israeli unpredictability. This is the isolation trap. As the conflict widens, the United States finds itself increasingly alone on the diplomatic stage, forced to defend its kinetic reality against a growing chorus of condemnation led by a rival that hasn't fired a single shot. The real war is no longer just about the control of oil valves. It is a contest to see who will be left standing with the moral authority to lead the post-conflict world. The volatility of global energy markets has reached a volcanic state as the kinetic reality of the Strait of Hormuz takes hold. On March 12, 2026, the international benchmark Brent crude surged past $100 per barrel, reaching intraday peaks of nearly $120, a level not seen in over 3 years. This is the market volcano in full eruption. The primary driver is not just the physical stoppage of tankers, but a psychological war premium that is hollowing out the confidence of global traders. The International Energy Agency has attempted to dampen this explosion by authorizing the largest emergency oil reserve release in history, 400 million barrels, but the market has treated this as a mere bucket of water thrown onto a forest fire. The paradox of the current energy crisis lies in the Hormuz silence. While the United States claims to have neutralized the Iranian surface fleet, the silence of the strait, through which 20% of the world's daily oil and 19% of its liquefied natural gas normally flow, is louder than any explosion. Major shipping conglomerates, including Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd, have suspended all transits, rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope. This adds weeks to delivery schedules and triples shipping costs, effectively imposing a global logistics tax on every consumer from Chicago to Tokyo. The strategic intent of the U.S. was to protect the flow, but the kinetic reality is that the mere threat of Iranian mine lane and drone strikes has achieved a de facto blockade that no carrier strike group has been able to break. The retention pivot occurs in the erratic behavior of the United States Department of Energy. Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm initially issued a statement suggesting that the U.S. Navy had successfully escorted a tanker through the strait, only to have the message deleted moments later. This syntactic instability has sent shockwaves through algorithmic trading systems, causing Brent prices to plunge $10 and then skyrocket back to $90 within a single hour. This is the credibility gap in action. When the world's primary security guarantor cannot maintain a consistent narrative, the market stops listening to speeches and starts pricing in the worst-case scenario, a prolonged regional war that removes 15 million barrels per day from the global supply. But if we view this through the lens of long-term survival, the real move is the stagflationary trap. While Washington fixates on the price at the pump, which has already exceeded $3.50 per gallon in many American states, the true danger is the secondary inflationary wave. The spike in energy costs is currently feeding into the prices of fertilizers, plastics, and global freight, threatening to push headline inflation in the U.S. toward 3.5%. For the neutral bloc of Asian economies, which depend heavily on Middle Eastern crude, the situation has moved from an economic concern to a national security crisis, with circuit breakers being triggered on the Nikkei and Kospi stock indices. The market volcano of 2026 has proven that in a hyper-connected world, You cannot strike at the heart of the dragon without setting the entire global treasury on fire. The internal fracture in Washington has finally reached a state of open political combat as the clock ticks toward the midterm elections of 2026. While Donald Trump maintains his syntactic signature of complete victory, the cold eye of political reality reveals a capital city divided against itself. Following a series of classified briefings, a coalition of Democratic and moderate Republican senators has broken the unity theater, demanding a public hearing on the war with Iran. The credibility gap has become an abyss. The administration's inability to define a clear end state is no longer just a strategic flaw nearing the end of March. It has become a domestic liability. The paradox of the American position is centered on the inconsistency of purpose. One moment, the White House projects the image of a decisive warrior ready to strike 20 times harder at the Iranian heartland. The next, it attempts to restrain Israel from targeting Iranian energy infrastructure to avoid a global economic meltdown. This strategic dissonance has drawn fierce criticism from figures like Senator Chris Murphy, who has branded the current trajectory as purely chaotic. The retention pivot occurs when the American public realizes that the war they are funding through the inflation tax lacks a coherent objective. Is the goal regime change, nuclear disarmament, or merely the protection of oil valves that are already closed? The kinetic reality for the average American is a cost of living crisis fueled by a war with no exit ramp. As Trump oscillates between claiming the war is nearly finished and suggesting the deployment of ground troops into the Iranian interior, the internal fracture has spread to the military leadership itself. The capability versus intent gap is now a matter of public record. The U.S. has the capability to destroy Iran's cities, but lacks the political intent to occupy them. This creates a strategic cul-de-sac where every bomb dropped increases the bill for the American taxpayer without bringing the nation any closer to a sustainable peace. Inside the halls of power, the isolation trap is closing. Iran has successfully bet on the fact that the U.S. political system would crack before the Iranian mosaic defense did. By sustaining their ability to strike back even in small, asymmetrical ways, Tehran has forced Washington into a war of attrition that the American electorate has no appetite for. The strategic intent of the Mahon reckless mouth diplomacy was to project strength, but the result has been a divided Congress and a confused public. As the fires continue to burn from Beirut to Tehran, the ultimate lesson of the 2026 conflict is becoming clear. A superpower cannot win a war if it cannot define what winning looks like. The Pax Americana is being hollowed out from the inside, not by Iranian missiles, but by the weight of its own contradictions. The missiles have been launched, the oil has stopped flowing, and the world is now waiting to see if the American system will survive the very war it started to prove its dominance. The terminal phase of the 2026 Middle East conflict has arrived at a point of no return, where the internal fracture in Washington meets the Samson option in Tehran. By the end of March, the Trump administration's tactical successes, the seizure of Karg Island, and the neutralization of the Iranian surface fleet have been rendered irrelevant by the strategic reality of a forever war without a finish line. The capability versus intent gap has finally inverted. While the United States possesses the capability to destroy, Iran has demonstrated the intent to endure, forcing a superpower into a $1 billion per day stalemate that the American taxpayer can no longer subsidize. The final retention pivot reveals that the war was never about a single island or a set of centrifuges. It was a stress test for the entire global order. The Pax Americana has been successfully baited into a strategic cul-de-sac. As the midterm elections loom, the administration faces a binary choice: a humiliating withdrawal that cedes the region to a Chinese-brokered alternative order, or a catastrophic ground invasion of the Iranian interior. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz remains a graveyard for the just-in-time energy myth, with global markets permanently pricing in the risk of a regional apocalypse. The missiles have stopped falling on the surface, but the nuclear brink now defines the new status quo. Iran, having survived the initial shock and awe, has emerged as a decentralized hydra with its nuclear breakout capability intact and shielded by the Zagros Mountains. The world of 2026 is no longer a unipolar playground. It is a fractured, multi-front reality where energy is a weapon, diplomacy is a ghost, and the cost of primacy has finally exceeded the wealth of the hegemon. The chokehold at Hormuz did not break the enemy, it broke the system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where our program comes to a pause. Please leave your thoughts in the comments so we can continue the discussion together. And if this is your first time watching, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the earliest notifications of our upcoming videos. Goodbye, and see you again soon.